Elias Rourke first rode into Blackwater County on a rain-soaked October evening with blood on his boots and a silver badge hidden inside his coat pocket. The mountains rose around him like the backs of sleeping giants, dark and endless beneath a bruised sky. Every ridge carried fog like old secrets. Pine trees bent under the storm wind, and the narrow road twisted through the Appalachian wilderness as though it wanted travelers to lose themselves before they ever reached town. The people of Blackwater did not trust strangers. They watched from porches and windows as Elias guided his exhausted horse down the muddy main street. Oil lamps glowed behind curtains. Somewhere far away, a church bell rang once before the storm swallowed the sound. The town looked older than the rest of America, like it had crawled out of another century and refused to move on. Elias stopped outside the sheriff's office, a crooked wooden building leaning against the wind like a drunk. He dismounted slowly. Pain spread through his ribs where a bullet scar never healed correctly. He untied a leather satchel from the saddle and climbed the porch steps. Inside, the office smelled of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and wet wood. A heavy man with gray whiskers sat behind a desk, reading by lantern light. He glanced up without surprise. "You're late," the man said. Elias removed his soaked hat. "Road washed out near Harlan Ridge." The old man nodded as though he already knew. "Sheriff Doyle." Elias offered his hand. Doyle stared at it for a moment before shaking. "You don't look like lawmen I've met before. Most lawmen aren't worth meeting." A faint smile crossed Doyle's face. "You'll fit in fine here then." The old sheriff reached into a drawer and pulled out a silver badge tarnished black around the edges. "You understand what this county is?" Doyle asked quietly. "A county? No. It's a wound. Folks here smile at church and bury bodies in the hills at night. Coal money runs through these mountains like poison in water. Mine owners buy judges. Moonshiners buy deputies. Families kill over creek land and settle feuds 20 years later." He slid the badge across the desk. "You still want it?" Elias stared at the badge. 3 years earlier, he had buried his wife beneath frozen earth in Kentucky. 2 months after that, he shot a man through the throat during a poker game in Knoxville. Since then he had drifted through mountain towns chasing work and forgetting pieces of himself one bottle at a time. Maybe this county was a wound. Maybe he was too. He picked up the badge. "I'll take it." Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. That first week, Elias learned the shape of Blackwater County. The mines sat north of town beneath towering cliffs where coal dust blackened the streams. Men worked 12-hour shifts underground while company guards watched them with rifles. Children carried lunch pails through mud roads before dawn. Widows dressed in black long before their hair turned gray. The southern hills belonged to moonshiners and old families who distrusted the government almost as much as they distrusted outsiders. They brewed whiskey in hidden valleys and shot revenue agents on sight. Between those worlds sat the town itself. People disappeared there, not often enough for newspapers to care. Just enough for fear to settle into daily life. On Elias's 4th day as sheriff, a woman named Martha Bell arrived at the office carrying a little boy wrapped in a blanket. "My husband's gone," she whispered. The boy clung silently to her skirt. Elias leaned back in his chair. "How long?" 3 days. "Where'd he go?" "He worked night shift at Mercer mine." Elias glanced toward the window. "Mine owners say anything. They said he quit." "Did he?" Martha shook her head violently. "Tom wouldn't leave us." Elias studied her face. Exhausted eyes. Bruises hidden beneath. "Makeup. Your husband hit you." She hesitated. "Sometimes. And you still want him found." "He's the boy's father." The child stared at Elias with hollow eyes far older than his age. Elias stood. "I'll ask around." By sunset he rode north toward Mercer mine. The mountains there looked carved open by giant claws. Coal smoke drifted from chimneys. Men emerged from tunnels blackened head to toe, coughing into handkerchiefs. The mine office sat above the workers like a fortress. Inside waited Victor Mercer. Tall, thin, immaculate black suit. He looked more banker than coal baron. "You're the new sheriff," Mercer said pleasantly. Elias remained standing. Tom Bell disappeared. Mercer poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "Men disappear all the time in Appalachia. I'm asking about this one." Mercer slid a glass across the desk. Elias ignored it. The mine owner smiled faintly. "Tom Bell stole company property. We fired him. After that, he vanished." "What did he steal?" "Dynamite. Enough to matter. Enough to concern me." Elias stepped closer. "You kill him." Mercer laughed softly. "You mountain sheriffs always jump to murder." You didn't answer. Mercer's smile disappeared. "I own half this county, sheriff. Judges owe me favors. Deputies drink in my tavern every weekend. If I killed every thief in Blackwater, there'd be nobody left to mine coal. Elias held his stare for a long moment. Then he left. Outside, miners avoided looking at him. All except one. A skinny old worker missing 3 fingers approached quietly near the stables. They buried him, the man whispered. Elias turned. Who? Bell. Where? The old miner glanced around nervously. Tunnel 7. Before Elias could ask more, the man hurried away into darkness. That night Elias entered Mercer mine alone carrying only a lantern and revolver. The tunnels groaned beneath the earth like something alive. Water dripped from wooden beams. The deeper he walked, the colder the air became. Tunnel 7 had been sealed. Fresh timber. Fresh nails. Elias touched the wood. Then he heard movement behind him. He spun. 3 armed guards stood in the darkness. One lifted a shotgun. You ain't supposed to be here, Sheriff. Elias drew instantly. The revolver exploded in the tunnel. One guard fell screaming. Another fired the shotgun. Wood splintered beside Elias's head. He dove behind mining carts as pellets tore through darkness. The third guard rushed forward with a knife. Elias shot him twice in the chest. The tunnel echoed with thunder. Then silence. Only the wounded guard remained alive, clutching his bleeding leg. Elias grabbed him by the collar. Who ordered this? The guard trembled. Mercer. What's behind that wall? The guard looked toward the sealed tunnel. Bodies. Elias stared at him. How many? The man began crying. I don't know. The sheriff forced open the timber barrier with a mining pick. The smell hit first. Rot. Death. His lantern illuminated collapsed rock and pale limbs beneath dirt. At least 6 bodies. Maybe more. One still wore a miner's helmet. Another had chains around his wrists. Elias stood frozen. He had seen war during his youth. Seen burned farms and men gutted in Tennessee fields. But something about those hidden corpses beneath the mountain felt worse. Not rage. Not battle. Just business. A cold machine feeding on desperate people. Behind him, the wounded guard whispered, Mercer says dead men don't unionize. The next morning Blackwater woke to chaos. Elias dragged the surviving guard into town and marched him straight into the courthouse. By noon rumors spread across every porch and saloon. Bodies in the mine. Sheriff found murder tunnel. Mercer involved. But power in Appalachia did not surrender quietly. Judge Holloway refused arrest warrants. Half the deputies vanished before sunset. Mercer himself remained inside his mansion surrounded by armed guards. The courthouse steps filled with shouting men before sunset. Miners demanded arrests. Company loyalists threatened violence. Women clutched frightened children while rumors spread faster than wildfire through the mountain town. Blackwater County stood on the edge of something ugly. Inside the sheriff's office, Elias slammed the wounded guard into a chair. You testify before the judge, he growled. The guard's face had turned ghost pale from blood loss. Mercer'll kill me. He'll kill you anyway. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains again. Sheriff Doyle entered carrying a bottle of whiskey and exhaustion in his eyes. He glanced at the trembling guard, then at the blood-staining Elias's coat. You dug too deep, Doyle muttered. Elias lit a cigarette. Too late now. The old sheriff shut the office door carefully. You think people here want justice? They want survival. Mercer owns the mine, the railroad, half the stores in town. Men owe him money. Families eat because he allows it. He murders workers. Doyle nodded sadly. And still they'll defend him. The wounded guard suddenly leaned forward. Panic filled his eyes. You don't understand, he whispered. There's more tunnels. Elias stared at him. What tunnels? The guard swallowed hard. Places nobody's supposed to know about. Before Elias could ask another question, gunfire exploded outside. The office windows shattered inward. The guard jerked violently as bullets tore through his chest. Elias dove behind his desk while Doyle cursed and reached for his revolver. More shots ripped through the walls. Men screamed outside in the street. Elias crawled toward the broken window and glanced out. Mercer's gunmen had surrounded the office. At least 15 of them. Rifles. Shotguns. One carried a torch. They're gonna burn us alive, Doyle muttered. Elias checked his revolver. 4 bullets left. Back door? He asked. Doyle shook his head. Already covered. Smoke drifted through the shattered windows as the attackers set fire to the porch. The sheriff's office groaned beneath spreading flames. Outside, one of Mercer's men shouted, "Send out Rourke and maybe the rest live." Elias looked toward Doyle. The old sheriff avoided his eyes. For a long moment neither man spoke. Then Doyle sighed heavily. You know, he said quietly, I used to believe law mattered. Another bullet punched through the wall inches from his head. But this county beat that out of me years ago. Elias grabbed a rifle from the rack near the door. Maybe that's the problem. The fire climbed higher. Heat filled the room. Doyle suddenly smiled bitterly. You really are crazy. Elias kicked open the side window and fired instantly. One gunman spun backward into the mud. The street erupted into chaos. Elias climbed through the flames as bullets tore around him. Doyle followed, coughing hard. They sprinted behind a wagon while townsfolk scattered screaming into alleys. Gunfire echoed through Blackwater. The mountains answered with thunder. A rider appeared suddenly at the far end of the street. Then another. Then 6 more. Moonshiners from Laurel Hollow. At their front rode Isaiah Cole carrying a double-barreled shotgun. Well, the old man shouted, looks like the party started without me. The moonshiners opened fire. Mercer's men scrambled for cover as shotgun blasts shattered windows and lanterns. Elias seized the moment. He rushed across the muddy street and tackled a rifleman behind a water trough. The man reached for a knife. Elias smashed his forehead against the guard's face. Bone cracked. The guard dropped limp into the mud. Nearby, Isaiah calmly reloaded while bullets snapped through the air around him. You always bring this much trouble. The old man yelled. Only on weekdays. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes. Then, Mercer's surviving gunmen retreated toward the northern hills. Blackwater fell silent except for crackling fire and distant crying. 3 townsfolk lay dead in the street. One was barely 16. Elias stared at the boy's body for a long moment. Then he looked north toward Mercer Mine. This ends tonight, he said. Isaiah studied him carefully. You talking revenge or justice? Elias didn't answer. Maybe he no longer knew the difference. Night swallowed the mountains as armed men gathered outside town. Miners carrying hunting rifles. Farmers with rusted shotguns. Moonshiners armed with pistols tucked into dirty coats. Fear had finally turned into anger. Elias stood before them beside a lantern. Mercer's got more men, someone warned. He's got walls too, another muttered nervously. Elias looked around at the exhausted faces surrounding him. These mountains been feeding rich men for generations, he said quietly. Coal, timber, blood, and every time somebody speaks against it, they disappear. Silence settled over the crowd. He buried workers beneath that mine because he believed nobody would fight back. Elias loaded fresh rounds into his revolver. Tonight he learns otherwise. The march north began beneath cold rain. Dozens of armed figures moved silently through the Appalachian darkness while thunder rolled overhead like distant cannon fire. Mercer Mine appeared just before midnight. The complex glowed against the mountainside. Guard towers overlooked rows of worker shacks. The mansion stood above everything like a king's castle. Elias studied the lights. Then he noticed movement near the cliffs. More guards than expected. Rifles positioned along the ridge. Mercer had prepared for war. Isaiah spat into the mud. Bastards saw us coming. A nervous miner whispered, maybe we should wait till morning. Elias shook his head slowly. No more waiting. He raised his rifle. The first shot shattered a tower lantern. Darkness swallowed half the camp instantly. Then hell erupted. Gunfire exploded from every direction. Miners charged through the rain screaming while Mercer's guards answered from barricades. Dynamite thundered near the rail tracks. The earth shook violently. Men died fast in the chaos. Elias fought through smoke toward the main buildings while bullets snapped past his face. A guard lunged from the darkness with a shotgun. Elias fired first. The blast hurled the man backward through a window. Nearby, Isaiah stood atop a coal cart firing both barrels into advancing gunmen like some ancient war spirit risen from the mountains themselves. The battle spread across the valley. Buildings burned. Horses screamed. Coal dust filled the air like black fog. Then Elias saw something that froze him cold. Workers chained beside one of the lower tunnels. Prisoners. Mercer's private labor force. Starved men blinking in terror beneath the gunfire. Elias rushed toward them. A wounded prisoner grabbed his arm desperately. There's children down there, he rasped. Elias stared. What? Mercer kept families locked up when workers tried escaping debt. Rage exploded through Elias so violently he nearly lost control. He shot the chains apart with trembling hands. How many? The prisoner pointed toward the underground shaft. Too many. Elias descended into darkness carrying only a lantern and revolver once more. The tunnels felt alive, like the mountain itself breathing hatred around him. He heard coughing ahead, then crying. The lantern illuminated cages. Actual cages. Women. Children. Broken men staring through iron bars. Elias stood motionless. Even after war, after death, After everything he had seen, this felt worse. One little girl clutched the bars silently. How long you been here? Elias asked softly. She shrugged weakly. Don't know anymore. Above them, explosions shook the tunnel ceiling. Dust rained down. Dust rained down from the ceiling in thin gray streams. The cages rattled with every explosion above. Somewhere deeper in the mine, timber supports groaned like dying animals. The little girl never let go of the bars. Elias knelt slowly in front of her. What's your name? Anna. Her voice sounded dry, like she had forgotten how to speak. How old are you, Anna? She stared blankly for a moment. 9, I think. Not know. That hit Elias harder than any bullet ever had. Behind her, other children huddled together in darkness. Thin faces, hollow eyes, some too weak to even stand. One woman stepped toward the lantern light shielding a baby beneath her torn coat. You really the sheriff? She whispered. Elias nodded once. The woman began crying silently. Not loudly, not dramatically, just exhausted tears from somebody who had already suffered beyond fear. Another explosion shook the tunnel. Dirt fell harder now. The mine was becoming unstable. Elias drew his revolver and fired into the first lock. The cage door creaked open. Everybody move, he ordered. Stay close to the lantern. Nobody moved. Fear had buried itself too deep inside them. The prisoners looked at one another nervously like animals expecting another trap. Elias holstered the revolver and stepped inside the cage himself. You're leaving tonight, he said quietly. Mercer's finished. A little boy suddenly asked, You promise? The sheriff looked at him. Children should never ask questions like that. Not unless the world had failed them too many times already. Yes, Elias said. This time they followed. Slowly. Weakly. But they followed. He led them through the tunnel while thunder from the battle echoed overhead. Smoke drifted through the shafts now. Somewhere farther up the mine, men screamed. The mountain itself sounded angry. Halfway to the surface, a miner stumbled against the wall coughing blood. We ain't gonna make it, the man wheezed. Elias grabbed him under the arm. Yes we are. Another violent tremor shook the tunnel. Then came a sound Elias recognized instantly. Cracking timber. His eyes widened. Run. The support beams exploded apart behind them. Rock crashed through darkness like an avalanche. The prisoners screamed. Elias shoved 2 children forward just as the tunnel collapsed behind them in a storm of stone and coal dust. Darkness swallowed everything. For several seconds nobody could breathe. Then the lantern flickered weakly through the smoke. Alive. Barely. A woman cried out from farther back. My husband. Elias turned. Part of the tunnel had caved inward completely. A trapped miner's arm protruded from the rubble. The man underneath screamed in agony. Without hesitation Elias dropped to his knees and started pulling rocks aside. Others joined him. Even starving prisoners clawed at the debris desperately. The mountain kept groaning above them. More collapse could come any second. Isaiah's distant voice echoed faintly from somewhere near the surface. Rourke. Elias ignored it. He kept digging. Blood ran down his injured shoulder. Dust filled his lungs. Finally they freed the miner's crushed body from the rubble. The man looked down at his ruined legs and began sobbing. I can't walk. Elias lifted him anyway. You don't need to. Another tremor hit. This one stronger. The tunnel ceiling cracked overhead. Everyone started running. The group burst from the mine entrance into cold rain and chaos. The battle outside had become pure madness. Buildings burned across the valley. Dead men covered the mud. Gunfire flashed through smoke and darkness. Isaiah stood near overturned rail carts firing at guards advancing from the ridge. When he spotted Elias emerging with prisoners behind him, the old man's face changed instantly. Jesus Christ! More prisoners stumbled from the tunnels. Women carrying children. Broken workers blinking against rain. For the first time in months. Mercer's remaining guards froze at the sight. Even they looked horrified. Because secrets lose power once exposed to the world. Elias handed the injured miner to nearby townsfolk. Then he looked uphill toward the mansion. Lights still burned in the windows. Mercer remained inside, watching, waiting. The sheriff picked up a fallen rifle from the mud. Isaiah grabbed his arm. You're bleeding bad. Elias ignored him. He kept children in cages. I know. He dies tonight. The old man studied him carefully through rain and smoke. That justice talking. Elias stared toward the mansion. No. Then he walked uphill alone. Bullets cracked through the storm around him as surviving guards tried stopping his advance. He fired back without slowing. One guard dropped from the porch railing. Another vanished behind shattered windows. Lightning flashed across the valley. For one terrifying second the entire mountain glowed white. And in that flash, Elias saw bodies everywhere. Miners, guards, friends, enemies, all broken the same. War always ended that way. At the mansion steps, another gunman rushed him with a knife. Elias sidestepped and slammed the rifle butt into the man's throat. Bone cracked loudly. The guard collapsed choking in the rain. The front doors stood open. Mercer was expecting him. Inside, the mansion felt disturbingly calm compared to the slaughter outside. Classical music played softly somewhere deeper within the house. A chandelier swayed overhead. Expensive paintings hung untouched while men died in mud below. Elias followed the music into a large study lined with books and whiskey cabinets. Victor Mercer sat beside the fireplace holding a glass in one hand and a revolver in the other. He looked almost relaxed. "You made quite a mess," Mercer said quietly. Elias aimed the rifle directly at his chest. "You locked children underground." Mercer sipped whiskey calmly. "You know what debt does to desperate people. Makes them run, steal, rebel. They were human beings. They were property." The word echoed through the room like poison. Elias felt something inside himself snap loose completely. Mercer noticed it too. The coal baron smiled faintly. "There it is," he whispered. "The animal." Outside, thunder shook the windows. Mercer slowly stood from his chair. "You think you're different from me, Sheriff?" "I am." "No," Mercer said softly. "You just kill for different reasons." Elias stepped closer. "You murdered innocent people." Mercer shrugged. "And you came here tonight with armed men knowing dozens would die." Silence filled the room. Because part of it was true. That was the horror of violence. Even righteous men carried blood eventually. Mercer walked toward the fireplace limping slightly. "You know what Appalachia really is?" he asked. "A machine. Always has been. Coal goes out. Coffins go in. Rain battered the mansion windows harder now. And men like you keep the machine running," Elias said. Mercer smiled bitterly. "No. Men like me built the machine." Then he raised the revolver suddenly. The shots exploded almost together. Pain tore through Elias's side. He staggered backward into a bookshelf. Mercer jerked violently as Elias's rifle round smashed through his stomach. Both men nearly fell. Smoke drifted through the study. Mercer stared down at the blood spreading across his shirt. For the first time, fear entered his eyes. Not fear of death. Fear of losing control. He sank slowly into the chair beside the fireplace, breathing hard. "You think this changes anything?" he whispered weakly. Elias pressed a hand against his bleeding side. "No." Mercer coughed blood onto the floor. "Then why?" The sheriff looked at him for a long moment. Then toward the burning valley outside. "Because somebody had to say no." Mercer laughed once. A weak, broken sound. Then his head slumped sideways. "Dead." Mercer laughed once. A weak, broken sound. Then his head slumped sideways. "Dead." For several seconds, the only sound inside the study was the fire crackling beside the corpse. Elias stood motionless. Blood dripped from his side onto the expensive wooden floor. Outside, gunfire still echoed faintly through the valley, but it was dying now. Men were realizing the fight was over. The coal king of Blackwater County was dead. And somehow that felt smaller than Elias expected. No lightning. No satisfaction. Just exhaustion. He lowered the rifle slowly. The mansion suddenly creaked around him. At first he thought it was thunder. Then he smelled smoke. Not from outside. From inside the walls. One of the lanterns downstairs had overturned during the fighting. Flames were spreading through the lower floor. Elias looked at Mercer's body. For a moment he considered leaving it there to burn. Then he remembered the children underground. The cages. The chains. No grave in the world could punish Mercer enough. Elias turned and walked away. The hallway outside glowed orange now. Smoke crawled along the ceiling. As he moved toward the stairs, he heard footsteps below. Fast. Running. He tightened his grip on the rifle. A young servant girl appeared from the smoke clutching a terrified little boy. She froze when she saw him. "Please," she whispered. "Don't shoot." Elias lowered the rifle immediately. "Who are you?" "She worked in the kitchen," the girl said quickly. "Mercer kept us here." The boy buried his face against her shoulder, trembling violently. "How many more inside?" "3 upstairs. 2 old workers in the cellar." Another section of ceiling collapsed downstairs in a burst of sparks. The fire was spreading fast. Elias coughed hard from the smoke. "Get outside," he ordered. The girl hesitated. "You coming?" Elias glanced back once toward the study where Mercer sat dead beside the fireplace. Then he nodded. "Yeah." The staircase groaned beneath them as they descended through smoke and flame. Halfway down, a burning beam crashed across the steps. The servant girl screamed. Elias shoved her backward just before the wood exploded into sparks where she'd been standing. The path downstairs was gone. Fire surrounded them now. The boy began crying uncontrollably. Elias scanned the hallway desperately. Then spotted a window at the far end. Move. He grabbed a heavy chair and smashed the glass apart. Cold rain burst inward instantly. The drop outside looked nearly 15 feet. Too high for the child. Elias turned toward the servant girl. What's your name? Lillian. You trust me, Lillian? She looked terrified, but nodded. Elias wrapped the boy in his coat first. Then lowered him carefully through the broken window. Drop him, he shouted down. Hands caught the child safely below. Isaiah's voice answered through the storm. We got him. Elias helped Lillian climb out next. The burning mansion groaned again behind them. Parts of the roof were already collapsing inward. Lillian slipped suddenly on the wet ledge. Elias caught her wrist just before she fell. For one terrifying second both nearly plunged together into darkness. Then Isaiah and two miners grabbed them from below and pulled them down into the mud. The moment Elias hit the ground, part of the mansion exploded behind them. Flames erupted through the upper windows. The roof collapsed inward with a thunderous roar. Everyone stumbled backward from the heat. Rain hissed against the fire. Elias stared at the burning house, breathing heavily. Victor Mercer disappeared forever inside the flames. Isaiah approached slowly beside him. It's over, the old man said. Elias kept staring at the mansion. No, he whispered. Now comes the hard part. The valley looked like hell itself by dawn. Bodies covered the mud roads beneath sheets and blankets. Some miners, some guards, most too young. The freed prisoners huddled near campfires while townsfolk tried feeding them. Children slept wrapped in borrowed coats beside women who still looked afraid to close their eyes. Smoke drifted through the ruined mine camp. And over all of it hung silence. Not peace. Just silence after violence. Elias sat alone near the rail tracks while Martha Bell stitched his wound with shaking hands. You should be dead, she muttered. Been hearing that for years. She almost smiled. Almost. Nearby, Isaiah spoke quietly with surviving miners. The old man looked exhausted now. Older somehow, like the battle had finally reached his bones. A young miner approached Elias nervously. What happens now, Sheriff? Elias looked around the valley. Burned buildings. Dead men. Freed prisoners. What always happens, he said quietly. Power finds a new face. The miner frowned. That's it. No. Elias winced as Martha tightened the bandage. Now people know the truth. The young man glanced toward the destroyed tunnels. Truth didn't stop bullets. No, Elias admitted. But lies built those cages. By midday the first state marshals arrived. Too clean. Too late. Their polished boots sank into mud still dark with blood. The lead marshal, a tall man named Barrett, surveyed the destruction with visible disgust. What exactly happened here? He demanded. Nobody answered immediately. Because there were too many answers. Finally Isaiah stepped forward. Mercer kept families prisoner underground, he said. Barrett frowned skeptically. That's a serious accusation. One of the freed children walked silently from the campfire then. Thin. Barefoot. Chains still hanging from one wrist. The marshal's expression changed instantly. More survivors emerged behind her. The truth walked into daylight all by itself. Barrett looked toward Elias. You led this attack. Yes. You understand there'll be consequences. Elias laughed weakly through pain. Marshal, look around. Barrett said nothing. Because consequences already covered the valley. Over the next several days Blackwater County transformed into something strange. Not celebration. Not mourning. Something heavier. Workers searched collapsed tunnels for bodies. Women cleaned blood from church floors. Families reunited with prisoners believed dead for years. And everywhere people whispered the same thing. Mercer had fallen. For the first time in decades, the mountain machine had broken. But power never dies quietly. 3 days later newspapers arrived from Lexington and Charleston. The headlines called it an uprising. A riot. A rebellion led by violent radicals. Some articles barely mentioned the prisoners underground. Others ignored them completely. Instead they focused on property damage. Dead guards. Economic loss. Elias read one paper beside the sheriff's office and laughed bitterly. They'll bury the truth same as the bodies, he muttered. Sheriff Doyle stood nearby smoking silently. World's bigger than Blackwater, the old man said. Most folks don't care what happens in these hills. Elias folded the newspaper slowly. That's why men like Mercer survive. Doyle nodded sadly. The old sheriff looked older every day now. Tired in a way sleep could never fix. You leaving? He asked finally. Elias stared toward the mountains. Fog rolled across the ridges like ghosts drifting through trees. Soon, you could stay. Folks would follow you now. That's exactly why I shouldn't. Doyle studied him carefully. Then he smiled faintly. Maybe you ain't completely crazy after all. That night the town gathered outside the church. Lanterns glowed softly in the darkness. Names of the dead were read aloud one by one. Miners, women, children, even some guards forced into Mercer's service by debt and fear. Because death flattened everyone eventually. Elias stood near the back listening silently. When they reached the 16-year-old boy's name, his mother collapsed to her knees beside the church steps. Her cry cut through the night sharper than any gunshot ever had. Nobody moved at first, because there was nothing anybody could say to a mother holding a folded bloodstained coat against her chest. The lantern light trembled in the cold wind. Elias lowered his eyes. He had seen death his whole life. War, shootings, hangings, mine collapses. But grief never became easier to witness. Especially not grief that young. Reverend Pike stepped down from the church porch slowly and helped the woman stand. She ain't alone, he whispered softly. The townsfolk gathered around her quietly after that. Not speaking, just standing close. Sometimes presence was the only mercy people could offer each other. Elias turned away from the church and walked toward the edge of town alone. Fog rolled across the hills beyond Blackwater. The mountains looked endless beneath the moonlight. Ancient, watching, always watching. Behind him footsteps approached carefully. Isaiah, you disappear a lot for a man everybody's looking at, the old man muttered. Elias lit a cigarette. Crowds make me nervous. Isaiah chuckled once before coughing hard into his sleeve. The cough lingered longer this time. Elias noticed blood on the cloth when the old man lowered it. You should rest. Isaiah shrugged. Resting's just waiting around to die slower. They stood in silence for a while listening to distant church hymns carried through the cold air. Finally Isaiah spoke again. You know the marshals are talking. About arresting me. About making an example. Elias nodded slowly. Expected. Men like Mercer had friends beyond the mountains. Important men. Men who cared more about burned property than dead miners. You regret it? Isaiah asked. Elias looked toward the dark mine far in the distance. Even ruined, Mercer mine still dominated the valley like a scar. No, he said honestly. Then after a pause, but I ain't proud either. Isaiah studied him carefully. That's probably why folks trust you. The old man walked back toward town afterward, leaving Elias alone beneath the night sky. Hours later, long after the memorial ended, Elias returned quietly to the sheriff's office. The building smelled of smoke and old whiskey. Broken windows let cold wind drift through the rooms. He sat heavily at the desk and removed the revolver from his holster. 6 empty chambers stared back at him. He cleaned the weapon slowly beneath lantern light. Hands steady, eyes tired. On the desk nearby sat newspapers from outside counties. Violent riot in Blackwater. Coal operations destroyed by armed mob. Lawlessness in Appalachia. Not one headline mentioned children in cages. Not one. Elias laughed bitterly under his breath. History always belonged to whoever printed it first. A sudden knock interrupted the silence. Martha Bell stepped inside carrying a sleeping child wrapped in blankets. Her son. He wouldn't sleep till he saw you, she whispered. The little boy blinked awake groggily when he heard Elias's voice. You leaving? He asked quietly. Elias hesitated. Children deserved honest answers. Yeah, why? The sheriff searched for words but found none good enough. Finally he sighed. Because towns like this don't stay peaceful after men like Mercer die. Martha understood immediately. Power vacuums. Revenge. New predators sensing weakness. Blackwater had survived one war. Another would eventually come. The boy reached into his pocket and handed Elias something small. A brass bullet casing carved with tiny crooked letters. Stay alive. Elias stared at it silently. Then slipped it into his coat beside the wooden badge. I'll try, he said. Near dawn the rain returned. Cold and steady against the rooftops of Blackwater County. Elias saddled his horse behind the sheriff's office while the town still slept. Or pretended to. People peeked through curtains as he rode slowly down the muddy main street. Nobody stopped him. Nobody cheered. This wasn't that kind of story. At the edge of town he noticed someone waiting beside the old bridge. Sheriff Doyle. The old lawman leaned against the railing smoking his final cigarette of the night. Figured you'd sneak out early, Doyle muttered. Elias pulled the horse to a stop. You gonna arrest me? Doyle laughed quietly. With what deputies? Rain tapped softly against the river below them. The old sheriff reached into his coat and removed a silver badge. Worn, scratched, heavy with years. My badge? Elias asked. County wants it back. Elias took the badge slowly. For a long moment he just stared at it resting in his hand. Then he tossed it into the river. Doyle blinked in surprise as the silver vanished beneath dark water. Why'd you do that? Elias looked toward the mountains. Because badges don't mean much where I'm going. The old sheriff smiled sadly. Fair enough. For the first time since arriving in Blackwater, Elias extended his hand. Doyle shook it firmly. Take care of yourself, the old man said. You too. Then Elias rode away into the rain. The mountains swallowed him gradually beneath fog and pine trees until even the sound of hoofbeats disappeared. Blackwater County kept moving after that. Because life always moves, even through grief. The mine remained closed for months while investigators searched the tunnels. More bodies surfaced. More names returned from the dead. Families finally learned what happened to missing fathers and brothers lost years earlier. The truth spread farther than Mercer ever would have allowed. Union organizers arrived from northern cities. Reporters wandered the hills searching for stories. Politicians made promises. Some genuine, most not. And through it all, one question lingered in whispers across Appalachia. Where was Elias Rourke now? Nobody knew. Some claimed they saw him in Kentucky breaking up a railroad robbery. Others swore he drifted west into Tennessee fighting moonshiner gangs. A few believed he died from his wounds somewhere deep in the mountains alone. The stories changed depending on who told them. But the legend kept growing. Children began treating him like folklore. A dark sheriff riding through storms. A ghost carrying justice in one hand and violence in the other. The truth was simpler. Months after leaving Blackwater, Elias arrived in a small town near the Virginia border, barely able to remain in the saddle. His gunshot wound had turned ugly. Fever burned through him for days. A widow named Eleanor Pike found him collapsed outside her barn during a snowstorm. Most people would have left a stranger to die. But mountain people understood suffering too well to ignore it completely. She dragged him inside. For nearly 2 weeks Elias drifted between fever dreams and silence. Sometimes he muttered names nobody recognized. Tom Bell, Anna, Mercer. Sometimes he woke reaching for a revolver that wasn't there. And every night he dreamed about the cages underground. Children staring through iron bars. Waiting. Always waiting. One evening he finally woke fully to find Eleanor sitting nearby sewing clothes beside the fireplace. You planning on dying here? She asked without looking up. Elias tried sitting upright and immediately winced. Undecided. She almost smiled. Used to be. That usually means trouble. It usually is. Snow fell quietly outside the cabin windows. Elias stared into the fire for a long time before speaking again. You got family? Had. The single word carried enough pain to end the conversation there. Loss recognized loss. No explanations necessary. Over the following weeks Elias slowly healed. He chopped wood when strong enough. Fixed fences. Spoke little. But peace never sat naturally on him. Elias noticed it most during quiet mornings. The cabin would still be dark outside. Snow pressed against the windows. The fire crackled softly while Eleanor prepared coffee in silence. Normal moments. Safe moments. Yet his hands still twitched toward weapons that weren't there anymore. Every sudden sound pulled his eyes toward the door. Every distant hoofbeat made his pulse sharpen. War leaves the body long before it leaves the mind. One morning Eleanor caught him staring through the window before sunrise. You expecting somebody? She asked. Always. She studied him carefully for a second. That sounds exhausting. It is. Outside, the mountains stretched white beneath winter snow. Beautiful in a cold, unforgiving way. Elias had almost forgotten places could look peaceful. Almost. Days turned into weeks. The wound in his side slowly closed. His beard grew thicker. The fever faded. And for the first time in years, nobody hunted him. No gunfire. No prisoners. No dead miners hidden underground. Just snow. Wood smoke. Silence. But silence can become dangerous for men carrying ghosts. Because eventually the mind starts talking louder than the world. One night Elias woke suddenly drenched in sweat. The nightmare again. Tunnel 7. Children screaming beneath collapsing stone. Mercer laughing through blood. He sat upright breathing hard while moonlight spilled across the cabin floor. Then he noticed Eleanor standing quietly near the doorway. How long you been there? He asked. Long enough. He rubbed tired hands across his face. Sorry. Don't apologize for surviving. The words hit harder than she intended. Because Elias wasn't sure surviving had been the right word anymore. Eleanor walked closer and placed a cup of coffee beside him. You ever tell anybody what happened to you? She asked softly. No. Why? He stared into the dark liquid. Because saying things out loud makes them real. Eleanor nodded slowly. They're already real. That silence afterward felt heavier than conversation. Finally Elias spoke. My wife died 6 years ago. Eleanor sat beside the fireplace listening quietly. Fever took her during winter. I was away working security for a rail company. His jaw tightened. By the time I got home, they'd already buried her. Outside wind rattled the cabin walls. I spent a long time angry after that, he continued. At doctors. God. Myself. Didn't matter. In Blackwater. Elias looked into the fire. Blackwater just gave the anger somewhere to go. Eleanor understood more than he expected. Maybe because grief speaks the same language everywhere. Weeks later winter finally loosened its grip on the mountains. Snow melted from the roads. Streams roared louder beneath thawing ice. One afternoon Elias repaired fencing near the edge of Eleanor's land when he spotted riders approaching through the trees. 3 men, armed. His body reacted before thought did. Hand instantly reaching toward the revolver at his hip. Eleanor noticed. So much for peace, she muttered. The riders stopped outside the cabin. Travelers by the look of them. Dusty coats. Hard faces. The oldest man removed his hat politely. You Elias Rourke. Elias said nothing at first. That was answer enough. The rider glanced toward Eleanor nervously before speaking again. We come from Kentucky. Why? The man swallowed hard. There's a coal town near Ash Hollow. Company guards killed 4 Union men last week. Elias's expression hardened immediately. Not my problem anymore. That's what folks said about Blackwater before you arrived there. Silence. The mountains breathed softly around them. The rider continued carefully. They're burning homes now. Taking families hostage. Sheriff down their works for the company. Eleanor looked toward Elias. He already looked tired again. Not physically. Soul tired. Like a man. Hearing old chains rattling in the distance. You got the wrong person, Elias said finally. The riders exchanged disappointed glances. One younger man spoke angrily before he could stop himself. People said you fought for folks who couldn't fight back. Elias stepped closer slowly. And people lie. The younger rider lowered his eyes immediately. The old rider nodded once. Maybe. He placed a folded newspaper on the fence post nearby. But desperate people still hope. Then the men rode away. Elias watched them disappear down the mountain trail without moving. That evening he sat alone on the porch staring at the newspaper beside him. Ash Hollow strike turns deadly. He never opened it. Didn't need to. He already knew the story. Different town. Different rich men. Same machine. Eleanor stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. You're leaving, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elias kept staring into the dark mountains. I'm tired. I know. I don't think there's any end to it. There probably isn't. He looked at her finally. Then why keep fighting? Eleanor thought for a long moment before answering. Because people trapped in cages pray somebody eventually hears them. The words settled heavily between them. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Tunnel 7 returned instantly inside his mind. Children behind iron bars. Waiting. Always waiting. The next morning he saddled the horse before sunrise. Eleanor stood beside the porch wrapped in her gray coat while fog drifted through the trees. Neither spoke at first. Because some goodbyes become smaller when spoken aloud. Elias tightened the final saddle strap slowly. You ever get tired of saving people? Eleanor asked quietly. He gave a faint tired smile. I ain't saved anybody. That's not true. He mounted the horse carefully, still favoring the old wound. Then paused. For what it's worth, he said softly, this place almost felt peaceful. Eleanor smiled sadly. Almost. He reached into his coat and removed the brass casing the Blackwater boy had carved for him. Stay alive. Elias looked at it one last time before setting it on the porch railing beside her. In case I don't, he said. Then he rode away through the morning fog. Again. Always again. The mountains swallowed him slowly beneath pine trees and mist while Eleanor watched silently from the porch. Far down the trail, Elias never looked back. Because somewhere ahead another town was already burning.